Tonight's class is Iggeres Hakodesh is Zion, the 7th letter in the Tanya. Are you prepared? This Iggeres Hakodesh revolves around the concept of Adam, or Adam Ha'elyon. The literal translation of the word Adam is man. The contextual, the translation of Adam is the anthropomorphic model. Anthropomorphic model means the mystical concept that the process through which there is a relationship between the Creator and His world, or the process through which the Creator creates His world, is compared, has a form of an Adam, of a man. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you're all familiar with this idea basically. That mysticism, Kabbalah, understands there to be a metaphysical, a spiritual, a mystical model of Adam, which is, so to speak, at the base, at the foundation of creation. The idea is this. First of all, on the basic level, you learn the Chumash, you learn the Tanakh, you learn the Chazal, you encounter multiple allusions, multiple references to God and to spirituality, so to speak, that suggest anthropomorphism, that seem to indicate the idea as if the relationship between the Creator and His world is as if He's, so to speak, human. We're coming now from Yapachas Yisrei. Hashem created the world. Gave the Torah, So the Torah describes God descending on a mountain. God's descent onto a mountain is a spatial illusion. It's referring to Him in a context of here and there, which is a major theological dilemma. In this week's Parsha, Parshas Mishpatim, we have one of the most controversial psukim in all of the Torah, and people don't even pay attention to it. In our Parsha, it's written, Vayidu es Elokei Yisrael. And they saw the God of Israel. That's what it says in the Parsha, Parshas Mishpatim. And it describes V'tachas Raglav, and underneath his feet is Kemaisa Livnas Hasapi. There is a Kemaisa, a likeness of Livnas Hasapi, which either means a white brick, a brick of sapphire, or a white brick. And as the heavens are clear and transparent. It's a biblical reference to God. They saw the God of Israel. And of course, all of these references, all these allusions, all these descriptions to God that seem to indicate some kind of a form that is human-like are very, very serious theological issues. They raise great questions. What does Torah believe is Hashem, is God? And of course, the traditional answer, the answer that you find in the Gemara and the answer of the philosophers is, quote, Dibra Torah kaloshen b'nei Adam. Torah speaks in the language of man. In other words, since Torah is being spoken to man, they describe God's relationship to man as though it were of a human. Not, God forbid, that Hashem has to move from one location to another. Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai doesn't mean Hashem took a shuttle or an elevator. And similarly, when it says Vayiros Elokei Yisrael, they saw the God of Israel, you cannot see God. God is invisible. It's a metaphor. It's a mashal. It's somehow an allusion to some communication between Hashem and His world. That because we are human, they describe Him as though He was human as well, even though none of those allusions are actual, are literal. This is the philosophical resolution to this question, and as I've shared with you many, many times over the years, the philosophical resolution to this question is essentially one size fits all. Every question in Tanakh and in Chazal, that describe Hashem as having moods and changing His mind and having regret and being upset and being happy, all of it is metaphor. None of this is literal. None of this is actual. We, as human beings, would have these kinds of responses under these conditions, so we describe God's relationship with His world as though He were having similar responses, or the Chakra Mutzeit, when in fact all you have is the nifal, the effect of these phenomena. There is not the Pa'ul and there is not the Payel. You cannot say about God that He has attributes, and certainly you cannot say that God is invested in His creation, where people are invested. This is the philosophical resolution. Kabbalah is, of course, much more complicated. Because Kabbalah says that there is truth to this. There's legitimacy to these ideas. In other words, Kabbalah doesn't say, well, Hashem doesn't have a hand. When it says Hashem has a hand, it means that He does something which is hand-like. Hashem doesn't have an eye. When He does something which is eye-like. Kabbalah says that there's something called Adam Ha'elyon. Adam Ha'elyon. Adam Ha'elyon is called a mystical realm, or a godly realm, where godliness is designed in an anthropomorphic, in an Adam-like model, in a form that is anthropomorphic, Adam, human-like, if you will, and that the creation is in the image of Adam Ha'elyon. In other words, Kabbalah doesn't simply say that all of these anthropomorphic allusions to God are making it easy for us to comprehend. Kabbalah says that all the anthropomorphic allusions to God have truth. However, the anthropomorphic allusions are not to God. You cannot describe God as a human being at all. They're allusions to what we call godliness. Elokut. Godliness. This is, of course, the great idea that Kabbalah introduces, that there is the Creator, the Boide, and then there is Elokus, godliness, and then there is the Nivroim, the various different creations. And Elokus, godliness, which is often called the light of God, the Ein Sof, as we call it in Kabbalah, is where you could say that there is a notion of Adam. In other words, when you talk about Hashem Himself, of course, Kabbalah agrees with philosophy that you cannot describe Him in any way, shape, or form. You cannot describe any definition, you cannot describe any perception, you cannot describe any relationship, because He's absolute. And therefore, in as much as we are concerned, He's beyond any kind of definition and access. But godliness, Elokus, does have a relationship to the creation. So this is where Kabbalah and Chakira, where mysticism, philosophy, so to speak, part company. In philosophy, all of the allusions to Adam, to God being man-like, are allegory, are mashal. And Kabbalah says, no, there's legitimacy to it in the realm that is called Adam Ha'elyon. Not God, chas v'sholem, but godliness, Elokus. So this is really the essence of Chokhmas HaKabbalah, the idea of Oir, the infinite light of the Eibishter, and Adam, the idea of the design of Adam Ha'elyon being, in so to speak, in the image of an Adam, of a human being. And of course, we then say the Eibishter created the world in the image of Adam Ha'elyon. Everything that exists in our world is in the image of Adam Ha'elyon. Now, I don't want to give you long speeches on this, because we've had a number of long speeches on this already in our Tanya learning. And I also do have a time constraint, naturally, obviously. But I just want to say a couple of points on this issue of Adam Ha'elyon. The first idea of Adam Ha'elyon is that another way of describing Adam Ha'elyon is to say the Torah. Before Hashem created the world, He created the Torah. The Torah is called the blueprint of the creation. The Torah is called the wisdom of God. The Torah has a structure, the Torah has a form, the Torah has a design. In other words, the Torah has reason, order, as opposed to the Creator, the Eibishter Himself, was beyond reason and beyond design. The design of the Torah is Adam. The Torah is designed in the model of an Adam. And from the design of Adam, which is the Torah, you have what we would call in fancy words, Adam Ha'elyon and Adam Ha'tachton. A godly realm and the lower realm, which is where human beings preside. And they are in the image that the Torah projects, which is an image of Adam. This is why it says in Kabbalah, it says in Zohar, that there are 248 mitzvahs and the 248 limbs of Adam Ha'elyon. The 365 prohibitions correspond to the 365 veins, arteries, nerves of Adam Ha'elyon, and so forth. Now, basically, the idea is that Adam Ha'elyon is infinite in order and complexity. In other words, just think about a human being's body. We're made up of pieces. But as long as we're healthy, the pieces that we are comprised of, on the one hand, add up to one, and on the other hand, they add up to infinity. Now, I don't mean this literally in the case of a person. I would say that I would mean it literally in the case of a person before the original sin. But to a great degree, this is true. Where do you see infinity in a human being? And to be sure, you don't see infinity only in human beings, you see infinity in all living things. We're made up of parts. How many parts? Depends how far you want to go. If you want to be basic, we're made up of 248 parts, like it says in data. You want to break it down further, you want to go down to the level of the cells. We're made up of millions, billions, and trillions of parts. And there are two things about those many, many, many parts, those tiny little units. Number one, each one of those has to be completely healthy within itself. And number two, each one of those has to join with all the other parts in a completely healthy way. Our body has literally trillions of cells. And in a healthy person, every single one of those cells, is A, healthy unto itself, B, part of a healthy cohesion, part of a healthy achdus. So you have individual little pieces, and that's limitation, that's gvul. You have diversity, you have different types of pieces, which is called in Hasidus hischalkus, diversity. Division and diversity are not qualities of God. God is one. But the unity within that diversity, the unity within those many different pieces, is godly. In other words, in a healthy person, the fact that so many individual aspects come together in a way where there is not one extra piece and there's not one missing piece, where the balance is perfect, is an expression of Ein Sof in Gevul. That's what it is. It's an expression of infinity in what we would call order, seder. And of course, the word that the Kabbalists would use, tikkun, tikkun. Tikkun means something which is complex, and the order of its complexity is an expression of infinity. In other words, it's not a simple infinity, it's a complex, detailed gvul, finity, but if you examine it precisely enough, you see that its order adds up to an infinity. And the idea simply is this. All living things have order. All living things have incredible order. Being human has a certain distinctive element of order. And that is that we have a right and a left and a center, and a top and a middle and a bottom. I've talked about this many times. Animals are horizontal. So it says in Sfarim that the horizontal physical design of animals is a symptom of a spiritual horizontalism, as it were. You have a higher part of the body, which is the brain, the middle part of the body, which is the higher emotions, and a lower third of the body, which are the more base emotions, the more instinctive emotions, the more primal emotions. In a human being, the mind is higher than the heart, physically. And the heart is lower than the lower third of the body. Which means to say that the mind of the human being is not bound by the emotions, and the higher emotions are not bound by the more basic emotions. In addition, human beings have a right and a left and a center. Every human being has both kindness and severity and a center. Animals are not that sophisticated. They're not that complete. They're not that balanced. Animals are described in Kabbalah as having one tendency, either chesed, either to the right or to the left. So when we talk about order, tikkun, and we say that in order, the details, a finite, complex, diverse system adds up to infinity, it's unique to Adam. In the human being, you see this balance, where there's limitation on the one hand, complexity and diversity on the one hand, but the order that it amounts to, what the Sach HaKol adds up to an expression of Ein Sof, because everything is represented. This is a small insight into the mystical concept of Adam Ha'elyon. The idea that The Eibishter created the world in the image of Adam means to say that before the Eibishter created the world, he created the Torah. The Torah is the blueprint for the creation. What is the Torah? Order, limitation, complexity. But through that order, through that limitation, through that complexity, can be manifest Ein Sof. We are only a metaphor for the anthropomorphic godly realm. In other words, in Kabbalah there's a world, there's a place where Adam is godliness. There's a mystical realm and a level where there is a model of Adam, which is, so to speak, the blueprint of all that comes after it, that is both godly and complex. There, the mathematics adds up to infinity. In us, for various reasons, perhaps the mathematics does not add up to infinity. Understand it this way. How many layers of stable reality would you and I say we know? We obviously know the stable reality of complex compounds, like things that are made up of many molecules, for example. When something is made up of a number of molecules and it achieves a certain level of stability, that's a finite, contained, preserved being. You go to a lower level, right? You're not dealing with molecules anymore, you're dealing with atoms. And there's a certain stability to an atom. If an atom didn't have a stability, it just would not exist. If you go to a deeper level, there is smaller units that have a certain level of stability. So what you're talking about is castes, layers, right? What's the lowest layer? What is the most elementary layer? You know and I know the answer to that question is we don't know. The argument of infinity means order that is perfect. If that hypothesis is true, if the order is perfect, you would have to say that there's an infinite number of layers. In other words, smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and in each realm there is order to a degree, and then on a small level there's more order. Now, I am sharing this as a philosophical idea, not as a physical idea. But that's the metaphor. That's why it's infinite. It's limited, complex, and it expresses the infinity of Hashem, is the point. Through this model, you have an expression of the Ein Sof. That's why it's godly. And mystically, that's why it doesn't die. That's why it lives forever.
I questioned when you said that man is infinite. I thought that man would be finite. And now you just said that the world is finite. But if the world cannot be finite if man is infinite.
Okay. It's a very, very... What I said is two opposite things. I said both of those statements. You understood me correctly. Are you finite or are you infinite?
I'm finite.
I would imagine, right? You occupy a certain amount of space, a certain amount of volume, a certain amount of mass. What do I mean when I say man is infinite? In you there is order. Do you understand what order means?
Yes.
Yeah. How many layers of order are there in you? You have only 2 hands, not 3, thank God. You have only 2 eyes, not 3, thank God. You have only 1 head, not 2, thank God. Right? Then you go down smaller and smaller and smaller. You go down to the cellular level, and to the molecular level, and to the atomic level, and the subatomic level. What's amazing is that the degree of order in your body is so unbelievably incredible that it staggers the mind. In other words, the percentage of you which is organized is 99.999999999%. If, God forbid, there was a little bit too much disorder in a person's body, they wouldn't be able to live. If we had 100% order, we would be Adam and Eve before the original sin, which means in theory we would live forever. Okay, so when I say that a human being has infinity, I mean that within the finity, within your limited body, there is a balance and an order that if you were to examine it, you would say, this is an expression of the infinity of God. Not that it's infinite, that's infinitely powerful, but that infinity is expressed through an infinite order. That's the whole beauty of it, that it's limited. Hidden within that limitation is actually something, it adds up to an infinite.
Then how could the universe...
It's the same principle. The universe is also finite. But hidden within the universe is also a degree of order, a degree of complexity, which adds up to an infinity. So when Kabbalah describes godliness as being Adam, your order is 99%. The universe's order is 98.5%. Atzilus, Adam, Ha'elion's order is 100%. So therefore, even though it's limited, it's actually infinite. This is the idea. Now, the way I understand it, let me give you a personal commentary. I hope nobody gets too caught up with this, because I don't want to delve into this. People who study evolution, what are the arguments in favor of evolution? What are the big arguments for evolution? And one of the biggest arguments in favor of evolution is how similar all living things are. All mammals have precisely the same number of bones, the same number of digits, the same number of organs, except that in certain mammals, certain aspects of the physiology become exaggerated, other aspects of the physiology become reduced. But there's incredible uniformity. There's a plan of a mammal. All mammals conform to that plan. And the same is true of fish, and the same is true of mollusks, the same is true of many, many broad categories of species. And when you dig deeper, you find order on the most elementary level. In other words, the argument in favor of evolution is, if you look at living things, it looks like, quote, they have a common ancestor, which is the essence of evolution. In other words, what makes evolution heipech haTorah, what makes evolution against the Torah? It's the belief that that only one type of life emerged first. And evolutionists are not even sure about that themselves. But the idea that there was one living being that came into it, and everything comes from that, because they seem to be so related. And it says in the Torah, leminehu. In the biblical account of creation, has God created different species, different types. So I have an idea. My idea is, if God created different species, why is there such a uniformity amongst all biological representations, types? And the answer is very simple. They're created in the image of Adam Ha'elyon. It's not a biological evolution. It's a mystical evolution. God created people separately and animals separately, and higher mammals and lower mammals, and higher primates and lower primates, and fish and birds, and separately. Leminehem. But they're all created in the plan by which the Eibishter created the world. In other words, in some way they reflect the Torah. So the uniformity of design, the apparent relatedness, is not a biological one, that one species actually came from another. It's a mystical one. Everything is created in the image of Adam Ha'elyon. But here's the catch. All animals are created in the image of Adam Ha'elyon, but they're distorted, they're disfigured, they're entangled. Which means to say, theoretically an animal could be Adam, which means to say, basically, right, left, center, top, middle, bottom, which is balance, but the way Hashem created them, they're entangled. Entangled means this animal will only be able to express chesed. This animal will only be able to express gevurah, and so forth. Which means to say, although they're created in the image of Adam Ha'elyon, it's messed up. It's distorted. When it says in the Chumash about human beings, Nasa Adam b'tzalmeinu k'dmusenu, let us make man in our form and our image, it means to say that human beings down here in this physical world continue to be a reflection of Adam Ha'elyon, of the original design. Which means to say we have the capacity to express every possible emotion. We have the capacity to express, therefore, free will. We have the capacity to be as great as the greatest angels and worse than the lowest animal. All those freedoms are given to man because we continue to be in the image of Adam Ha'elyon. This is a basic mystical idea, that when the Eibishter created the world, it's in the image of Adam. I suppose the earliest model of this would be the Torah. And of course, in the image of the Torah, the Eibishter created worlds, in quotes. And there's Atzilus, Adam Ha'elyon, a godly realm. A godly realm means where the light of God is manifest in this design, in this structure, in this order called Adam. Now, you can't really ask about God why. It's not a fair question. Because when you say about God why, you're presuming something. The presumption is that you can answer that why with a because. And if you're dealing with God, everybody understands that it's not that we don't understand Him, but that He's higher than reason fundamentally. So you can't really ask why. Nevertheless, we're going to ask why. In other words, within the framework of reason, which in our culture you would say within the framework of the Torah, and Torah is reasonable. Why? Why does Hashem create everything in this framework of Adam? And the short and simple answer to that question is because of two ideas: limitation and diversity. Hashem is one. And when you say Hashem is one, it means a lot of different things that all mean one, and even more one, even more one. And Hashem is indivisible, plain, has no details. Creation is many. Many means many different aspects and many different types of aspects. In other words, there's an order to creation. It's an expression of Hashem, but in the creation, you don't see the simple unity of God, you see the possibility for theoretically infinite complexity. And this creation, which has details and diversity, is by definition limited. Anything which is complex and diverse is limited. Infinity is plain. Infinity is simple. So the Kabbalah and Hasidus explain that the notion of Hashem creating the world in the framework and the model of Adam is what we call in our tradition tzimtzum, contraction. In other words, Hashem created the world and He sustains the world. There is, so to speak, a continuous investment of Hashem in His creation. Hashem is infinite. Hashem is plain. The world is finite. The world is complex. In order for Hashem kavayochel, so to speak, to have a relationship with a limited world, in other words, with a finite and complex and diverse world, His channel of hashpah, the flow through which He has a relationship with His world, must also be limited. Reduced, exactly. And this is the simple explanation for why there is this model of Adam. Why does everything in the creation reflect a supernal, a mystical concept of Adam on the very simple level? Because what that I'll get to you in a second, represents is limitation. Think of it as a transformer system. Right? You have something which is infinite, a very powerful electrical current. It's very good, but it's also very destructive. If you want to use it in a constructive way, you have to reduce it. The creation is limited. The Creator is infinite. The process of reduction by which there is an investment of the Creator in His creation is called tzimtzumim, contractions, reductions, and the model of this process is Adam. In other words, before Hashem creates the world, He creates a blueprint which limits the flow of energy, light, life, and energy from Hashem to the creation in such a way that the world should be able to receive it. Okay, now, so here we have an Iggeres Hakodesh that talks about the model of Adam. It talks about the anthropomorphic model. In other words, not the physical person that you and I know, but the metaphysical source, the mystical spiritual source of everything that exists in the world. According to Kabbalah, there is Adam, which is the source of everything. You want to call it the Torah, you're free to do so. In this Tanya, the Alter Rebbe observes three models of this Adam. The first model of this Adam is the Torah itself. The Torah, which is the source of the mitzvahs, of course, is in the design of Adam. How that is exactly, I don't know. I'm not that big a chochem, not that big a mystic. But al pi Kabbalah, this is emes. The Torah's basic design is the design of Adam. In other words, the wisdom of God that He created as the foundation of His creation has the image of Adam. Number two, mitzvahs. Mitzvahs. There are 613 mitzvahs. 613 mitzvahs are a complete Adam. Just like according to Kabbalah we say that there's, according to Torah we say there's 248 limbs and 365 nerves, veins, arteries, sinews. I don't know exactly what goes in and what doesn't go into that calculation. The mitzvahs, I say, the limbs, you have a Mishnah that lists what the 248 limbs are, but I've never seen any place in Torah list what the 365 arteries are, correspond to the 613 mitzvahs. And the third image of that is Neshamas Yisrael. The collective Jew also adds up to 613, also adds up to Adam. So the Torah is a complete Adam. The mitzvahs are in the image of the Torah, they're also a complete Adam. Neshama Yisrael, the collective Jew, is a complete Adam, they're in the image of the Torah and the image of the mitzvahs. According to Kabbalah, this is represented by Adam Harishon, and it's represented by Yankov Avinu. The Gemara says about Yankov Avinu, Shufra the Yankov me'ein Shufra the Adam Harishon. Yankov Avinu was as beautiful as Adam Harishon. So mysticism interprets this to mean Adam Harishon was one person. And I want to make clear, Adam Harishon means Adam and Chava, that's one being. In Adam you have all the souls of the Jewish people that are going to be born until Mashiach comes. In this one person, in this one soul, you have in a microcosm, in a miniature way, all the Neshama Yisrael that will be born. Yankov Avinu is in the image of Adam Harishon, to say Yankov Avinu also carries the souls of all the Jewish people that are ever going to be born on a different mystical level. But the Torah is in Adam, mitzvahs are in Adam, and the Neshama Yisrael is in Adam. So the Alter Rebbe makes this simple point that I made to you before, which is that the number 613 is only a basic number. It's a general number. When you say that Adam represents finity, complexity, diversity, and order that ultimately adds up to infinity, what you're saying is 613 is a basic design. The 613 mitzvahs. In every mitzvah there are innumerable halachas. In other words, if you would divide the Torah up into 613 sections, that's only a basic division. You can divide it, and you can divide it, and you can divide it over and over and over again. In other words, the division is many times over. So we use the number 613 because it represents the basic model of Adam. But if you delve deeper, 613 is not 613, it's 613 many, many times over and over and over again, because you go deeper and deeper, more and more and more details. And the same is true of Neshama Yisrael. 613 is a basic number of souls. But those 613 have many multiples over and over and over and over again. The Rebbe makes the point, how you understand it exactly, I don't know. But he makes this point nevertheless, that it adds up to an infinity, theoretically an infinite number of souls. In other words, how many Jewish souls are included in theory in Adam Harishon and Yankov Avinu? 613 is a basic number, but it's where it is, millions and billions of neshamas. When you split the basic aspects of Adam into smaller and smaller and smaller units, just to use a physical analogy, as you would divide up a human body into millions and billions of cells. Now, I want you to forgive me. I'm going to make a statement, and please don't ask me questions, because my answer is I don't know. Kabbalah, when it talks about neshamas, uses the number 600,000. How 600,000 corresponds to 613, I genuinely do not know. So please don't ask me, because you're going to make me look bad, so I don't want to look bad, so don't ask me. So it says in Kabbalah there's 600,000 souls. And that when the Jewish people left Egypt, the 600,000 male souls that left Egypt were called general souls. Those are the greatest souls. In each one of those 600,000, you have 600,000 sparks. Which means, in theory, how many Neshama Yisrael could be from Matan Torah till Mashiach? 6 times 6 and 10 zeros. That's 360 billion Neshamas. It doesn't mean that there mean this many Jews, because this goes into the question of Gilgulim and fulfilling your mission and so forth. The way it works is these 600,000 souls each have a mission. If they complete their mission, that's the end of the story. If they don't complete their mission, a child's soul, a secondary soul, is broken off and is created to finish the mission. If that secondary soul fails at its mission, there's a tertiary soul. And that's what we call Gilgulim. The point is, when we use numbers like 600,000 or 613, these are basic numbers. The deeper you go, the more detailed, the more aspects you have. The constant is that you're talking about a diversity and a complexity and an order. An order which, even though it's limited because of its order, it adds up to Ein Sof. It adds up to infinity. Not that it's infinite in its order. It's infinite in its balance. It's infinite in its tikkun. So the Alter Rebbe says, all of creation follows this model. All of creation follows this design. The same model, the same design that you have in Torah, the same model, the same design you have in mitzvahs, And the same model, same as you have in the Shemas Yisrael, you have in the whole creation. Everything in creation is created in the image of Taryag. Basically, 613. Why? And the answer is, like I told you earlier, because it's a finite world. And because it's a finite world, the investment of the Creator, the creation has to correspondingly be finite. Now comes a very interesting idea. But I have to preface. The preface is that the Alter Rebbe doesn't say this in this Iggeres Hakodesh. When you read this letter, it's sort of the missing link. I have no other way of explaining this Iggeres Hakodesh. I took out the commentary, I looked. I cannot say I'm sure that this is the meaning of this Iggeres Hakodesh, but I'm Karav Lavale. I'm so certain that this is the Kavanah that I'm almost certain this is the intent. Although it's unspoken. According to the information that I shared with you, the model of Adam, the anthropomorphic model, which is represented by the number 613, is based on the basic idea that creation is limited. And once something is limited, it has to have some kind of a structure, some kind of a design. This is the design that the Eibishter chose, because in this design, on the one hand, you have finity and complexity and diversity. On the other hand, it's expressing an infinity, Ein Sof. There are two levels. There's an outer realm and an inner realm. In other words, if we can accept the idea that everything in creation follows the model of Adam, man, anthropomorphic, and the anthropic model, the anthropic design, the anthropic form, and that this allows for there to be complexity and limitation, you must understand that there's an outer and an inner model of this. The outer image of this is the creation. All of creation reflects Adam. How all of creation reflects Adam, I have no idea. You know, it says in Chassidus, if you were smart enough, you can study the globe, its density, its volume, its mass, and understand Malchus of Atzilus. Malchut of Atzilus, a mystical level. In other words, the whole creation, the physical creation, is in the image of the metaphysical creation. If you have the wisdom, you have the depth, if you have the profundity and the background, and to be sure, the humility and the divine inspiration, you can study the physical universe and have a sense of the spiritual realms that it mirrors, that it reflects. But there is order in everything. And ultimately, the order in everything is a reflection of the order that exists in the Torah, which is the source of everything. And I want to digress. I want to go off on I want to say something that doesn't say here, just to titillate you. I want to share with you an idea. In the physical universe, everything is round. Everything is circular, right? The planets are round, the stars are round, the universe is considered circular. And there are physical explanations for it. They have to do with the laws of gravity and the nature of physical things and so forth and so on. But there's a mystical reason for it as well. And one of the mystical ideas, and I'm not trying to answer all questions, just showing you an insight. One of the mystical ideas, which is very, very important in Kabbalah, is that whenever Kabbalah talks about a circle, they use the metaphor of ibur, of a fetus, of an unborn child. What is the fetal position? What does it mean to be a fetus? It means to be curled up. Right? The knees, Reisha ben Birkav, the head is between the knees, the whole body is curled up. The physical shape of a fetus has to do with reality. It has to do with the physical biology. The way the Eibishter made women and their capacity to carry children, which is an unbelievable miracle. But Kabbalah explains the concept of being curled up as being the opposite of being human. Humanness, as I explained it to you before, what separates man from animal is that we're a right, a left, and a center, a top, and a middle, and a bottom. The fetus is that model curled up on itself. In other words, not developed, not fully expressed. So the mysticism of why everything in the physical universe is circular, because this is the lowest realm. Nothing is developed. In other words, how is this world in the image of the higher worlds the way the higher worlds would be in a fetal position. A globe is round. Where's the top? Where's the top of the earth? Yerushalayim. How inconvenient, right? No human being who studies the sciences would say that the top of the earth is Jerusalem. The equator, the poles. Where's Jerusalem? It's someplace, it's not in the middle. The point is, how could Jerusalem at Yisrael be the center of the world? It's not the center of the world. Now, I don't want to answer this question, but I do want to propose to you this thought that if we could accept that the earth is a fetal version of an Adam, and what were to happen if that Adam were to open up? So it wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't be that everything is equal. Every point on the globe could be the top. There would be a right and a left and a center, a top and a middle and a bottom. You can explain at least the logic that says there is a top to the earth. It's not just a uniform globe. Physically, everything appears as a globe because this is the world called Igulim. Igulim means balls, circles. The malach are called oifanim. The lowest angels are called oifa. You know what oifa means? It means a wheel. The lowest level of angels are in a fetal position. They also have all the sophistication and all the order and all the completely curled up on itself. The malachim of Asiya, of this world, are called oifanim, which means balls. It's the same principle. Inside that, you have the same order. But it's all curled up. It's not developed. It's a very beautiful mystical insight into seeing how all these things fit. I'm not answering questions. I'm just offering you commentary. Aside, getting back to the original point, when Kabbalah teaches us that everything is created in the image of the Torah, and the Torah conforms to the model of Adam, and that the basic number that represents this is Taryag, there's an inside and an outside, an inner dimension and an outer dimension. The outer dimension is the creation. When you say the outer dimension is the creation, that means not just this world, this universe, it means all the worlds. And in every world there are many different creations, right? What's the equivalent of an animal in the spiritual realms? Angels. What do angels and animals have in common? They're not complete. They don't have all, they're polar. They're one extreme or another. They're not balanced.
They have no free choice.
They don't have a right, a left, and a center, a top and a middle and a bottom, which is the design of Adam. In other words, what makes us in the image of God is that we retain all those faculties, all those aspects, which at least in theory creates the possibility for free choice. So every realm, every world is all in the image of the Torah, which has the basic design of Adam with the basic design of Taryag. But as it relates to what's called the external world, the outer model of this, the purpose for this design is to limit, is to contain. But there's an inner dimension. And the inner dimension is Torah and mitzvahs. The inner dimension is Yiddishkeit and Neshamas Yisrael. Like the world itself, like the creation itself, Torah and mitzvahs and Neshamas Yisrael conform to the model of Adam. And they conform to the basic number of Taryag, as I explained, 613, as I explained to you earlier. However, they're the purpose of the creation. They're the inner tract, so to speak. So there's the world per se. The world per se conforms to this model, it conforms to this design, so that there should be complexity and order and ultimately limitation. And the reason for this design is to speak, limit the flow of energy from Hashem to the creation. As the world is limited, so should the divine investment in it be correspondingly limited, so it shouldn't destroy the creation. But there's a secret dimension. The secret dimension is that into this finity, into this gavul, Jewish people should live and learn Torah and do mitzvahs, which are in the exact same model. Also 613, also the Torah, also Adam, and so forth. It's one but. Although Torah and mitzvahs are complex, although Torah and mitzvahs are diverse, although Torah and mitzvahs are limited, every aspect of Torah or mitzvahs carries the whole infinity of God. In other words, the inner dimension of creation also has the complexity and the order of Adam, but this is a very different concept of tzimtzum. It's a very, very different concept of contraction and reduction. In the world, per se, in order for there to be a world, there has to be a limit of the divine investment in creation. In Torah and mitzvahs, the expression that I grew up with, that I heard from my teachers as I was a teenager growing up learning yeshiva chassidus, is called the Hagbala Atzmit. Hagbala Atzmit in Ashkenazish, in English. Hagbala Atzmit means to say, any mitzvah that you perform is limited. If it wasn't limited, you wouldn't be able to perform it. You put on tefillin. Tefillin is supposed to have 4 parshas and so many oisias. One extra parsha, one extra letter, it's not a little more, it's no good. The mitzvah to be done precisely like this, not more or not less. The esrog has to have a certain size, not smaller. You can only shake it for 7 days. On the 8th day, it's a waste of time. It's not an esrog. In every mitzvah, there's limitation. This limitation, if we were smart enough, would correspond to the model of anthropomorphism, Adam, to correspond to the Tayag, but in mitzvahs, it's not that each mitzvah is an aspect. Each mitzvah is a limited expression of godliness. Each mitzvah is a capsule for all of Ein Sof. Whatever mitzvah anybody performs, this mitzvah becomes a vehicle for the true infinity of Hashem. One of the most radical statements in all of Tanya, and it really is a radical statement, and Alter Rebbe says it as a glatt, simple, is, the Zohar says, Leis machshava tfisa bei klal, it's absolutely impossible to hold God. Right? That's a Zohar. It's the way we say it at Shabbos, in Pesach Elio. So Alter Rebbe adds a few words. Ki im kasher mislabeshes b'teiro mitzviseha. Ki im. I don't speak Ashkenazi, Sephardi. I'll read it to you inside. I'll be able to do it with the Sephardi Havara. To do it by heart and with the language is a little too complicated for an Ashkenazi like me. Okay? Leis let machshava tfisa bei klal, ki im kasher tfiso, tofes, umitlabeshet, b'torah u'mitzvitah. Azai tfisa behen. When a person learns Torah, does mitzvahs, they're holding Hashem, holding God. In other words, mitzvahs are limited, and they're capsules for the Ein Sof. Which means to say, although Torah on the higher level and mitzvahs on the lower level conform to the same design of Adam and Taryag, limitation, complexity, order, it's not as it is in the creation, limitation, complexity, order, because each detail is finite. But rather, each detail has the whole Eibishter. In every word of Torah, in every mitzvah, you have the whole Ein Sof. It has limitation, complexity, and order, so we should be able to hold it. If tefillin were infinite, we couldn't hold it. So tefillin is leather, boxes, and straps. But in the tefillin, you have Ein Sof. So you have an inner and an outer world, track, so to speak. The outer world, the model of Adam, the idea of Taryag, is because it's a limited, complicated world. When it comes to Torah, and in a lower mitzvah level, when it comes to mitzvahs, each aspect is the whole of the Ein Sof. Its limitation, its complexity, and its order allows for us to be able to hold it. Which of course leads to one of the most important points in Yiddishkeit, and that is, you cannot decide which mitzvah is more important and which mitzvah is less important. You cannot decide what aspect of Judaism takes precedence over which, because any mitzvah is Ein Sof. Any part of Torah is Ein Sof. By itself, right. It adds up to Adam, but each aspect is Ein Sof. Which is why the Chazal tell us, ha'osek b'mitzvah patur min ha'mitzvah. Ha'osek b'mitzvah patur min ha'mitzvah. When you're doing one mitzvah, you're exempt from doing another mitzvah because it's the same thing. It's Ein Sof. It's Hashem. So what am I supposed to do? So if that's the case, if in fact it's true that when you're talking about the inner dimension of the creation, which means the purpose of the creation, Torah and mitzvahs, it also conforms to the model of Adam and to Taryag, complex, diverse, limited order. But we say that each aspect is Ein Sof. So how am I supposed to pick which mitzvah to do? So the Alter Rebbe brings a Gemara, a Talmudic allusion, that somebody once asked one of the Ameroyim. In early years when I taught this, I looked up the Gemara, I didn't look it up. Avuch b'may havazoyt fei. Maybe you remember. Avuch b'may havazoyt fei. Who said to whom? Avuch. Somebody once asked one of the Chazal, what was your father Zahir Tfei most particular about? And at that time he answered him a mitzvah tzitzis. Avuch b'moed Zahir Tfei means this. We all have tayag mitzvahs. We all have to learn the whole Torah on all of its levels and layers. At the same time, in each time and in each place and in each circumstance, there's a mitzvah which is the primary mitzvah, the mitzvah that becomes the most important mitzvah for you to do today. Not because that mitzvah is more precious than another, but because this is what the Eibishter wants, what Hakodesh Baruch Hu wants. In every generation, in each era, in each time, and under each circumstance, we have to do all the mitzvahs and study all of the Torah. And each aspect of mitzvah and each part of the Torah is by itself an infinity. Yet in each time, in each place, in each circumstance, there's a mitzvah which takes precedence over others. Not that this is more. There's no such thing as more and less. Each aspect is by itself ein sof. But throughout history there are different emphases, different priorities. If I may interpret a bit, that means to say over the course of history, there's also an Adam. Over the course of the history of Klal Yisrael, each mitzvah was a priority at a particular point. But not because each one by itself is limited. Each one by itself is ein sof. It adds up to it. Adam. In each time, in each place, there's a different priority. And on this basis, the Alter Rebbe explains a number of Maimonei Chazal. What does it mean? Chelik b'lekei Yisrael. In Gemara, you find this expression. You know, if a person does a certain thing, he has a chelik, he has a portion in the God of Israel. Or on the other hand, you have Rahman Aslan, Ein lahem chelik, does not have a portion in Lekei Yisrael. What does it mean, a portion of God? How can you have pieces of God? Chelik b'Lekei Yisrael, what does that mean? So Alter Rebbe says this means that although every Jew has to do all mitzvahs, there are chelik, parts of Torah that at a particular time, in a particular place, become the Zohar Tfei, they become the channel, the pathway to all which it's more important than any other mitzvah. Not chas v'shalom that it's more than another mitzvah, but this is what the Eibishter expects at that particular time. That's Tzav Ashur. Let me give you an example. The Jews were in the desert. What do? They studied Torah. In fact, they were redeemed from doing most mitzvahs. Many mitzvahs they didn't do in the midbar. They studied Torah day and night. That was their Zohar Tfei. This is what they had to do. They do other mitzvahs. They're supposed to sit in the desert and interpret the Torah. But there's a story. The story is that they were supposed to go into the Holy Land after a year or so. And they didn't want. And they defied Moshe Rabbeinu. They defied Hashem. They said, no, we want to stay in the desert. And they lost that opportunity. Their children went into the Holy Land. What did their children do? Their children fought wars. And their children or their grandchildren became agriculturalists. They became farmers. What do all these three generations have in common? They all serve God. That's what have in common. What separates them from one another? How they serve God. A Jew in the desert, whose job is to study Torah, so I want to be a farmer, he's right and he's wrong. This is not what the Eibishter expects from you now. A Jew in Eretz Yisrael is supposed to be an agriculturalist and separate Bikurim and Truma and Ma'aser Ishna and Ma'aser Sheni and Ma'aser Oni and Leket and Shikha and Pei. I want to study Torah. All of Yiddishkeit applies to all of Yidden at all times and at all places. And at the same time, there's a concept of Zohar Tfei. There's a mitzvah which becomes the primary mitzvah which Yidden have to do. And on this basis, the Alter Rebbe explains a passage in the Siddur. Ashenu matev chalkeinu, u'manoim g'od aleinu, u'mayafa Yerushaseinu. Hashem is how fortunate we are. Matov, how good chalkeinu is our portion. Umanoyim, how sweet, how pleasant is G'od Aleinu, our lot. Umayafa, and how beautiful is Yerushaseinu, our inheritance. Now let's go backwards. Okay, if we went forward, then we wouldn't be Jews. Let's go backwards. What do we know about an inheritance? We know two things about an inheritance. A, you don't have to do anything to inherit except B. You inherit because you're alive. Api halacha, as long as you're born, you're inheriting. In other words, a fetus doesn't inherit. The moment you're born, you inherit. What do you inherit? Everything. B, you have no idea what you're going to inherit. You don't control your inheritance. The person you're inheriting from determines what you inherit. You simply inherit because you are. Correct? Goydel. What does goydel mean? A lot. What does a lot? It doesn't mean a piece of land. A lot means something, to be very technical about it, which is entirely random. Goral. Put 10 numbers in a hat and pick one. That's a goydel. It's totally random. The connotation of a goydel means something which is entirely arbitrary. Like in the story of Purim. The center of the Purim story is a goydel. It's a lottery, chance, arbitrariness. And of course the whole beauty of the story of Purim is that when you leave things to chance and to arbitrariness, you discover that God's running His world on that level also. Chelek means a portion. In this chelek,
that God is running the Quran?
The miracle was that even though it seems like it's totally arbitrary and random, in the end we saw that Hashem is running the world on that level as well. Chelek means a portion. Now when you think about a portion, you imagine taking a knife and cutting a piece, and your portion. How can one idea be called a chelek and a goydel and a Yerusha? Now understand that frequently this siddur is interpreted that there's three separate ideas. Chelek is one idea, goydel is a separate idea, and Yerusha is a third idea. In this against the Hakodesh, the Rebbe says, Yiddishkeit is your portion, it's your lot, and it's your inheritance. How can you define Yiddishkeit as a portion, and a lottery, and an inheritance? They're so different. A portion seems to indicate that you're choosing it. A lottery seems to indicate that it's totally random. And an inheritance indicates it has nothing to do with you at all. So the Rebbe says the answer to that question is this mysticism, this idea that there are many different mitzvahs and they're distinctive. And we have to do them all. Each one of them is infinitely precious. You cannot pick and there's no such thing as a bigger mitzvah and a smaller mitzvah. Every mitzvah is the essence of godliness. And in as much as that is concerned, Yiddishkeit is an inheritance. It's a Yerusha. It's a gift from God, which we have nothing to do with, because every point in Judaism, the whole infinity. And yet, although every Jew at every time and every place has to fulfill all the mitzvahs, there is a priority in each age. What's the most important mitzvah? Not, God forbid, both. Basically for the klal, for the prat in a more subtle way, but for the klal. And therefore, although on the one hand, Yiddishkeit is a Yerusha, there is a chelek, there is a portion of Yiddishkeit which becomes the center, the priority of people in that age. Which portion is your chelek is a goydel. In other words, what determines why in a particular age this becomes the most important thing is goydel. What does goydel mean? It's higher than logic. Why at a particular point in time this is the most important mitzvah? At a different point in time, another thing is the most important mitzvah is the Eibishter's choice. It's a random thing. It's goydel. So Yiddishkeit is a Yerusha. We inherit it. In other words, we could never create this. It's a gift from God. And at the same time, all of Yiddishkeit belongs to all of the Jewish people. At all times, there is a concept of chelek. Every era has its priority. And which portion of Yiddishkeit is the priority at a particular time is a goydel, is a determination that's made by Hashem on a level which is beyond our comprehension. And of course, the Alter Rebbe finishes this Iggeres Hakodesh by saying, what is the chelek, which is the goydel of our Yerusha? Today, it's giving tzedakah. This is the suffix. In the Tanya, what I just told you is not written. But in the Alter Rebbe's letters, they publish the prefix and the suffix of this Iggeres Hakodesh. Alter Rebbe says today, the chelek of Klal Yisrael is tzedakah. As we've been discussing almost every Iggeres Hakodesh. The question is, why do we believe him? Because we have a Rebbe. He tells us what the emphasis is today. You have to in the Lubavitch that I grew up in, we were taught that no Jew can afford to define their Jewishness by themselves without reaching out and making another Jew. Making another Jew. That in today's age, after the Holocaust, no Jew can justify their existence as a Jew by their own personal connection to God. You have to make another Jew.
But anything a person cannot be Mekayim, it's full Hashlama, he could be Mekayim it with the Rambam in Hilchis, I think it's in Hilchis Yossi Tanya, Hilchis Yossi Tanya, he speaks about it. It brings the pasuk, V'hoyo Maisa Tzedakah Sholem. That's why Tzedakah is associated with Shleimus, because Tzedakah could be mashlim everything, everything that a person really truthfully cannot be mashkin for whatever reasons, but tzedakah could somehow could make up for it.
So this is the class.